HMS Indefatigable was the lead ship for the class of battlecruisers named for her, being essentially an enlarged version of the preceding Invincible class. Indefatigable epitomized Admiral Jackie Fisher's idea of a battlecruiser, being fast and lightly armored. Commissioned in 1911, she saw extensive service in the Mediterranean and was there when the First World War broke out, participating in the chase for SMS Goeben and Breslau as they made their way to the eastern Mediterranean in the relative safety of the Ottoman Empire. Staying in the eastern Mediterranean in case the German ships attempted a breakout, she helped bombard Ottoman positions in the Dardanelles. Returning to the United Kingdom in February 1915, she joined the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron with her sisters Australia and New Zealand. Being present for the Battle of Jutland, she was at the rear of Admiral Beatty's line. She and her counterpart in the German line, SMS von der Tann, the two oldest battlecruisers present, fired salvo after salvo at each other. And 14 minutes after opening fire, at 4:03, Indefatigable was struck by multiple salvos. In the maelstrom of the battle, the first of 3 British battlecruisers was lost in a tremendous explosion. All of her crew, except for a couple of men, went down with the ship. Before we get into the loss, I'd like to tell you all a little more about HMS Indefatigable, her armor, and some context to the fleet she was fighting in. Indefatigable was commissioned in February 1911, along with her sisters New Zealand and Australia. The 3 battlecruisers were an addition to the 1908 building program, after the press stirred up public opinion due to the expanded German building program. In essence, the ships were enlarged versions of the preceding Invincible class, where I think R.A. Burt in British Battleships of the First World War has an interesting quote. He writes, "Admiral Fisher's dictum, speed is armor, was never better exemplified than in this class. Their extremely poor protection made them vulnerable as capital ships. Some of the changes as compared to the Invincible class were, the belt abreast A and Y turrets were reduced 6 inches to 4 inches, right forward on the belt was reduced from 4 inches to 2.5 inches, with the 2.5 inches thick armor plate carried to the stern. The main deck armor of 3/4 of an inch outside the forward bulkhead was suppressed, while the main deck armor over the magazines was increased to 2 inches. The lower deck in the forward section was increased to 2 inches, while the aft section was reduced to 2 inches. The armor arrangements for Australia and New Zealand were modified as compared to Indefatigable. For the first 6 months of the war, Indefatigable was stationed in the Mediterranean and missed the Battle of Dogger Bank. Dr. Norman Friedman, in his book The British Battleship 1906 to 1946, discusses the lessons learned from Dogger Bank according to Admiral Beatty. The main point was that Beatty did not believe the German shells were that effective, especially the 11-inch guns, and that his ships were hitting effectively, though they were not hitting fast enough. This idea about a faster rate of fire was prevalent in the Royal Navy before the war and during, especially in the battlecruiser squadrons, with a faster rate of fire being preferred over careful calculation. This obsession with speed led to unsafe practices. To quote Dr. Friedman, Beatty's ships could not fire as rapidly as he might have expected at Dogger Bank because, over the past few years, standard fleet practices had been to overload magazines and shell rooms. Cordite magazines was normally stowed in fireproof Clarkson cases. Cordite cartridges were removed from the cases when they went into the hoists. The fuller the magazine, the greater the congestion of the cases at the bottom of the hoist caused. Beatty was not the only one concerned with the rate of fire. After Dogger Bank, his commander Admiral Jellicoe circulated a gunnery order pressing for a higher rate of fire and opening fire more quickly, on the ground that in itself, the British fire on the ships would make it more difficult for the German gunners. That is, rapid fire was both offensive and defensive. Well, where are the unsafe practices? It just seems like they wanted a higher rate of fire. The real problem was how the officers chose to solve the problem. They had 2 ways, we're again taking from Dr. Friedman. One was to stow bare charges in the turrets, in the working chambers, in the handling rooms below the turrets, placed there to break up the direct path between the turret and the magazine, and at the bottom of the hoists. In effect, the working chambers and handling rooms became ready-use magazines carrying unprotected charges. A second means of firing more rapidly was apparently to remove the anti-flash doors between the magazines and the spaces at the bottom of the hoists so that the cartridges could be passed more quickly. Both practices contravened magazine regulations. With that being said, let's get to our story. Admiral Beatty, the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons, along with the 5th Battle Squadron of Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, set off from the Firth of Forth late in the evening of the 30th of May, 1916, as Admiral John Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, had departed earlier in the evening to support the advance of the battlecruisers. Beatty headed east over the North Sea as British intelligence understood the German scouting groups under Admiral Franz von Hipper and the High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer were making an advance into the North Sea to engage and destroy a portion of the Grand Fleet, ideally at least. A possible target was Beatty's ships. As Nick Jellicoe writes in his book Jutland: The Unfinished Battle, the Germans could read Beatty's character perhaps better than Beatty realized. They knew that he would run into the chase, and that this was their chance to lure a portion of British naval forces into the waiting guns of Scheer, heading north not far behind with the main battle fleet. Between 2:20 and 2:30, either side's cruiser forces had spotted smoke over the horizon, and within an hour, the two sides came into view. Upon seeing the ships at around 3:30 p.m., Hipper understood that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base, and made a turn of 180 degrees to the south. Where I think a quote from Gary Staff's Skagerrak, The Battle of Jutland Through German Eyes, is interesting. High tension dominates with all the crew, as after scarcely 1 hour after sighting British light forces, smoke clouds and heavy masts of ships climb over the horizon. I hear more, as Admiral Hipper on the Admiral's Bridge said to his Chief of Staff in his Bavarian dialect, "Rada, I'll eat my broomstick if that's not Beatty again." Intending to close the gap, Beatty increased speed, leaving the 4 Queen Elizabeth-class ships behind. By 3:40, the battlecruisers had formed a single line ahead steaming south, with Lion leading, followed by Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, New Zealand, and Indefatigable. However, the Germans opened up the battle when at 3:48, while smoking a cigar, Hipper gave the order to open fire. The two sides began engaging each other, where on the German side, George Hasse, SMS Deflinger's first artillery officer, has this to say. The 6 ships, which had been proceeding in 2 columns, formed a single line ahead, like a herd of prehistoric monsters. They closed on one another with slow movements, spectre-like, irresistible. At the last, there was a dull roar. The Lutzow is firing her first salvo, and immediately the signal "open fire" is hoisted. In the same second, I shout, "Salvos fire," and the thunder of our first salvo crashes out. On the British side, Flag Captain Alfred Chatfield on HMS Lion has this to say. We were now steaming at 19 knots on a south-southeasterly course. The enemy battlecruisers were now rapidly closing on us, steering southwesterly. The range receiver on the bridge showed 20,000 yards. I was on the compass platform with my navigator, Commander the Honorable Arthur Strutt, and my small staff. Beatty remained for a time on his bridge. I wanted him to come on the compass platform and send a message to Seymour, telling him to advise Beatty that the range was closing rapidly, and that we ought to almost at once to be opening fire. This was a duty I had handed over to the Chief of Staff, but I could get no reply. The Vice-Admiral was engaged in an important message to the Commander-in-Chief. 18,000 yards. I told Longhurst to be ready to open fire immediately. The turrets were loaded and trained onto the leading enemy ship, the Lutzow. This was found in Jutland, 1916, Death in Grey Waters by Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. As I discussed in the past, fire distribution was an issue for the British side during the opening stage of the battle. Beatty intended for Lion and Princess Royal to fire on the leading German ship Lutzow, while the other ships followed along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Deflinger, Tiger on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Moltke, and Indefatigable on Von der Tann. Lion and Princess Royal fired on Lutzow as they should have done, but Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz, leaving Deflinger unmolested. If we were discussing other ships like Queen Mary or Deflinger, this would be an important talking point. However, since we're discussing Indefatigable, we'll be at the back of the line. Indefatigable, one of the oldest British battlecruisers currently engaged, faced off against the oldest German battlecruiser, Von der Tann. On the German side, we turned to Korvettenkapitän Marholtz, Von der Tann's first artillery officer. For a long time, I occupied my post on the direction indicator periscope and directed my battery and rangefinders on the enemy, which was magnified 15 times through my glass, and I could make out the enemy's ships. Fire distribution from left, the signalman called through the armored slit, and I slowly counted along down the enemy line through my periscope. The loading of the guns had been ordered some while before in the turrets. The men had shoved armor-piercing shells into the barrels, on which a not-too-friendly greeting for the English had been written in chalk. The adjusted range was 162 hectometers, then finally the release came. Open fire, and at that same second the first salvo crashed out against the enemy. Almost at the same time, one saw the clear muzzle flash and the spiraling, yellow-brown smoke cloud climb over the ship. Accurately, the middle of the 16th Division of the direction indicator lay under the middle funnel of the battlecruiser Indefatigable, the name of which I did not know at the time, only recognizing the type. In this private duel, as Robert K. Massey describes it, the two oldest, smallest, and slowest of the battlecruisers dueled at the rear of their respective lines, starting from 349 onwards. Again, turning to Marholtz, I guarded myself against observing hits and adhered strictly to observing the fall of shot. My young lieutenant in the mast also reported a hit. Straddling, good rapid, followed the order after the impact, and salvos now followed in brief intervals, salvos following salvos into the air. The enemy fired slowly. You could see the flash of their salvos, and those who had time could use a stopwatch to determine the enemy fall of shot near the ship. Still, the enemy did not shoot well, and many salvos came nowhere near the target. Probably over there they had poorer visibility than us. Our light ship color made it difficult in the hazy weather. Meanwhile, the fire of von der Ten was extraordinarily successful. The enemy sometimes disappeared completely into the surrounding columns of water. Von der Ten was putting out a withering barrage. In a short space of time, she fired 52 11-inch shells and 38 5.9-inch shells. The ranges between the two ships varied between 14,000 and 18,000 yards. On the British side, at the rear of the line, Indefatigable was putting out some serious fire of her own. In that short span of this rancorous ship-on-ship duel, she fired some 40 rounds of her 12-inch guns. But, according to Marholtz, who was fired upon by those shells, it wasn't very accurate. Gary Staff reports that during this phase in the battle, von der Ten was not hit. Although later on in the battle, she would receive several hits and have all 8 of her guns put out of action for periods of time. Nevertheless, the gunnery duel continued, and shortly past 4 p.m., Indefatigable was struck in multiple places, where we turn to Gary Staff and German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations. At 5:03, it was observed that Indefatigable was struck by 2 or 3 shells from one salvo around the aft gun turret. A small explosion occurred, and Indefatigable swung out of line to starboard, probably to throw off the German aim. She appeared to be settling by the stern when 2 projectiles from the next salvo struck her, one on the forecastle, one on the forward turret. After a further 30 seconds, there was a tremendous explosion forward, and the ship lay over to port and capsized. It is thought the aft magazine of the X turret exploded, and then the forward magazine of the A turret. A total of 57 officers and 960 men perished with the explosion, while 2 survivors were later picked up by the German torpedo boat S-16. For clarity, Staff is using the German account for the battle, and therefore it is recorded at 5:03 p.m. Another account found in Staff's book is that of Marholtz, as he witnesses what his guns were doing. He writes, "Meanwhile, the fire of von der Ten was extraordinarily successful, and the enemy sometimes disappeared in the surrounding columns of water. As Indefatigable was so covered, seemingly she ceased fire and attempted to withdraw from the deadly fire by a zigzag course. But thanks to the good glasses, each movement could be recognized. The enemy turned away, and despite the straddles, I changed 1 hectometer ahead, and she turned nearer, 1 hectometer back, and changed the deflection a little to the side, to the bow of the enemy. While the salvo was underway, a new position for the indicator was ordered, and I immediately received the new movement and deflection ahead for the new position of the enemy. Then, 14 minutes after the opening of fire, the enemy was fatally damaged. In the direction indicator periscope, briefly after the impact of a salvo, I saw a giant explosion in the aft gun turret. A bright flash of flame, and the ship's debris was thrown in a wide arc through the air. Seemingly, it was the turret roof, which, through the pressure of the explosion inside, had been lifted off. The next salvo gave the ship the rest. It hit further forward, and soon after the impact, a tremendous black smoke cloud climbed from the ship, reaching double the mast height, and the enemy ship disappeared. Probably an oil bunker was hit and burning. For the sake of certainty, another salvo was fired into the smoke cloud, but scarcely would have reached the target that had already vanished into the waves. Although the auxiliary observation officer was certain that the enemy had sunk, I was skeptical because I knew from experience just how easily at this range one can be mistaken. People often see what they want to see. Only after the smoke had cleared and nothing was to be seen, and the other officer assured me again and again, did I allow myself to be convinced and report the success to the commander. Below decks, the news that the enemy had been blown up spread like wildfire, and in my headphones, I could hear the men's cheers. From the other British ships, the loss of Indefatigable was seen from multiple angles. One of the most notable angles was from a navigating officer as he looked back on Indefatigable. We were altering course to port at the time, and it seemed as if her steering was damaged, as she did not follow around in our wake, but held on until she was about 500 yards on our starboard quarter. While we were still looking at her, she was hit again by 2 shells, one on the forecastle and one on the fore turret. Both shells appeared to explode on impact. There was about 30 seconds, and then the ship completely blew up. The main explosion started with sheets of flame, followed immediately by a dense dark smoke cloud that obscured the ship from view. All sorts of stuff was blown into the air, a 50-foot picket boat being blown up about 200 feet, apparently intact, though upside down. Another interesting location comes from the battleship Malaya, as she and her sisters attempted to catch up with the battlecruisers. Sub-Lieutenant Carlson watched through a 5-inch slit in the armor of the battleship, writing, "I could not see the enemy who were on the far side of the battlecruisers, but I could see the splashes of their shells falling around our ships." Both Tilstone and I were watching, absolutely fascinated, and suddenly he said, "Look at that!" I thought for an instant that the last ship in the line had fired all her guns at once, as there was a much bigger flame, but the flame grew and grew till it was about 300 feet high, and the whole ship was hidden in a dense cloud of yellow smoke. The cloud hung in the air for some minutes, and when it finally disappeared, there was no sign of the ship. Although I did not know the order of the battlecruiser line, I had a feeling it was the Indefatigable, in which I had a great friend. As stated in the quote from Gary Staff earlier, 1,017 men went down with Indefatigable. In the chaos and confusion of the explosions and subsequent sinking, a couple of men survived and were picked up by a German destroyer later. I've seen some debate to the exact number of survivors. 2 to 3 seems to be the range, as there appears to be some confusion regarding signalman John Boyer, who would die of his injuries. I'll let you all do some research on that, as I want to focus on 2 other signalers, C. Falmer and Seaman Elliott. Starting with Falmer, who shortly before 4 p.m. was ordered aloft to clear the signal flags, which had become entangled as the ship maneuvered, where Falmer recounts, "The message came up for someone to go aloft to clear the flags. I went up, took my sea boots off first, climbed out the foretop, and went up the Jacob's ladder right to the very top. I unfurled the flag, and I sat on the wireless yard looking around, naturally watching the firing. There was a terrific explosion aboard the ship. The magazine went. I saw the guns go up in the air just like matches. 12-inch guns they were, bodies and everything. She was beginning to settle down. Within half a minute, the ship turned right over, and she was gone. I was 180 feet up and thrown well clear of the ship. Otherwise, I would have been sucked under. I was practically unconscious, turning over really. At last, I came to the top of the water. When I came up, there was another fellow named Jimmy Green, and we got a piece of wood. He was on one end, and I was on another end. A couple minutes afterwards, some shells came over, and Jim was minus his head, so I was left on my lonesome. There was nothing to be seen, only the 5th Battle Squadron coming along. They started to open fire, and the German shells were dropping short. I could feel them myself in the water, my feet, my legs. They went, and about half an hour later, 4 German cruisers came along, so I ducked my head down because probably if they had seen me, they would have put a shot at me. They would have done, to put you out of your misery, you see. Then they cleared off and it turned dark. There wasn't a sound, nobody near me. It was pitch dark. I'd given up all hope practically. I let go once, but I struggled back again quickly. Between 2:30 and 3, all of a sudden, I could hear something coming towards me. I gazed up, and it was a destroyer. They stopped, and 2 German sailors got down on the fender, grabbed me by my shoulders, and pulled me aboard. I didn't remember anything till the next morning. When I came to in the engine room, they were mopping me down with waste. I was smothered in oil fuel. Able Seaman Elliott was also on the top when the other 1,017 men had been killed. Unfortunately, I don't have his account. I will remember to place a link to the Imperial War Museum's website where you can listen to Falmer say his account in his own voice, a truly remarkable piece. One last place we haven't heard from was the flagship Lion. For that, we turn to the excellent Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the Winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey. He writes, "Stricken, with smoke pouring from her shattered hull, Indefatigable rolled slowly onto her side, all the while driving through the water. Then the huge vessel turned completely over and plunged, taking with her 1,017 officers and men. Only 2 seamen survived, both shell-shocked and delirious when they were pulled from the sea hours later by a German destroyer. Curiously, because of the din of the battle, and the Indefatigable was the last in line, many in Beatty's squadron were unaware what had happened. From Lion's Bridge, an officer looked back to admire the following ships, with their huge bow waves and flashing broadsides. Astern of the rear ship was a colossal pall of gray smoke. I gazed in amazement and, at the same time, realized that there was only 5 battlecruisers in our line. Where was the 6th? The unpleasant truth dawned on me that the cloud of smoke was all that remained of the Indefatigable. When it comes to the losses of the battlecruisers at Jutland, I've done a video covering all 3 British battlecruisers lost and some of the reasons for their losses and the sudden explosions. I don't want to go into as much detail here as I did in that video, and because I'm not a historian, I don't want to be mistaken as such. But for the sake of clarity and wanting to put an emphasis on some things, going back to the beginning with a quote from Dr. Freeman and some of the possible reasons for the loss of Indefatigable were the unsafe cordite handling practices. One was to stow bare charges in the turrets, in the working chambers, in the handling rooms below the turrets, placed there to break up the direct path between the turret and the magazine, and at the bottom of the hoists. In effect, the working chambers and handling rooms became ready-use magazines carrying unprotected charges. A second means of firing more rapidly was apparently to remove anti-flash doors between the magazines and the spaces at the bottom of the hoist so that the cartridges could be passed more quickly. Both practices contravened magazine regulations. In that same vein, an interesting quote comes from Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. "It was indeed the hapless Indefatigable. In a highly visible disaster which occurred right in front of the aghast battlecruiser fleet, a salvo from the Fonder 10 had crashed down onto the ship at 4:02. By accident or by design, the Indefatigable sheared out a line to starboard and a few seconds later was hit by a second salvo, which provoked a huge explosion. Accounts to exactly what happened are slightly contradictory. Until her sunken wreck can be examined in detail by marine archaeologists, it will not be possible to say with certainty what the sequence of events was, but it seems likely that the cordite charges in the X-turret were ignited and a flash passed down to the magazines aft. However, it is entirely possible that a shell penetrated right through the armor and set off the magazine directly. That same sentiment of uncertainty is found in Nick Jellicoe's description of the event, where he writes, "Finally, at 4:02, at a range of around 16,000 yards, the German shells tore through the thin plating just above the armored belt by X-turret and exploded in the magazine. A second salvo hit A turret and may have caused a cordite fire. 30 seconds after the superstructure was hit, a ripple of fire seemed to race from the bows right the way down back the 19,000-ton battlecruiser as their magazine exploded." Shortly before 3:50 p.m. on May 31st, 1916, the first of many salvos was fired by the German 1st Scouting Group in the opening action of the Battle of Jutland, the run to the south. Their targets, the 1st and 2nd British battlecruiser squadrons, were giving chase, and now that they had closed their range, they formed their battle line. The British battle line was formed with the flagship Lion leading, followed by Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, and the 2 ships of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, New Zealand and Indefatigable. The British ships were given their targets, where the flagship Lion and the 2nd ship Princess Royal were ordered to fire on the leading German ship Lützow, and the other ships were to follow along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Deflinge, Tiger on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Mootka, and Indefatigable on Fonder 10. Lion and Princess Royal did as they were ordered. However, Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz and not Deflinge, leaving her unmolested for almost 10 minutes. Regardless of that error, Queen Mary was one of the best gunnery ships in the Grand Fleet, excelling at the speed school that was favored by people like Admiral David Beatty. However, this obsession with speed led to unsafe practices like stacking ammunition outside protective magazines and leaving the anti-flash doors open during drills or battles, like the one she was currently engaged in. Later in the battle past 4:20 p.m., Queen Mary was hit several times, and at 4:26 she exploded. Well over 1,200 men perished. All officers except 4 midshipmen died, with a total of just 20 survivors. Admiral Beatty, the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser squadrons, along with the 5th Battle Squadron of Queen Elizabeth-class dreadnoughts, set off from the Firth of Forth late in the evening of the 30th of May, 1916, as Admiral John Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, had departed earlier in the evening to support the advance of the battlecruisers. Beatty headed east over the North Sea as British intelligence understood the German scouting groups under Admiral Franz von Hipper and the High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer were making an advance into the North Sea to engage and destroy a portion of the Grand Fleet, ideally at least. A possible target was Beatty's ships, as Nick Jellicoe writes in his book Jutland: The Unfinished Battle. The Germans could read Beatty's character perhaps better than Beatty realized. They knew he was a fox-hunting man. They knew that he would run into the chase, and that this was their chance to lure a portion of British naval forces into the waiting guns of Scheer, heading north not far behind with the main battle fleet. Between 2:20 and 2:30, either side's cruiser forces had spotted smoke over the horizon, and within an hour, the two sides came into view. Upon seeing the British ships at around 3:30, Hipper understood that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base, and made a turn of 180 degrees to the south. Intending to close the gap, Beatty increased speed, leaving the 4 Queen Elizabeth-class ships behind. By 3:40, the battlecruisers had formed a single line ahead steaming south, with Lion leading, followed by Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, New Zealand, and Indefatigable. However, the Germans opened up the battle win at 3:48 while smoking a cigar. Hipper gave the order to open fire. The two sides began engaging each other, where on the German side, Georg von Hassa, SMS Deflinge's first artillery officer, has this to say in Jutland 1916, Death in Grey Waters by Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. All was ready to open fire. The tension increased every second, but I could not yet give the first order to fire. I had to wait for the signal from the flagship. 15,000, as my last order rang out, there was a dull roar. I looked ahead. The Lutzow is firing her first salvo, and immediately the signal, open fire, is hoisted. In the same second, I shout, salvos fire, and like thunder, our first salvo crashes out. The ships astern follow suit at once, and we see all around the enemy jets of fire and rolling clouds of smoke. As I mentioned in the introduction, fire distribution was an issue for the British during the opening stage of the battle. Beatty intended for Lion and Princess Royal to fire on the leading German ship Lutzow, while the others followed along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Deflinge, Tiger on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Moltke, and Indefatigable on Von der Tann. Lion and Princess Royal fired on Lutzow as they should have done, but Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz, leaving Deflinge unmolested. Still, Queen Mary was considered a crack gunnery ship in the Grand Fleet, and as such, she opened fire in earnest. In part, she got that reputation because of people like Petty Officer Ernest Francis in X-Turret, where he was watching his men like a hawk to ensure they were ready to fire, writing, "We had started on the great game. I had no means of telling what the time was, and if I had, I probably should not have looked, because getting a turret started is an anxious, rushing time for a captain of a turret. Once started, it is easy to keep going. The gun's crew was perfect, inclined to be a little swift in loading, but I gave them a yell and pointed out to them that I wanted a steady stride, and after that, everything went like clockwork. Lieutenant Ewart came out to the cabinet twice and yelled something to encourage the gun's crew, and yelled out to me, 'All right, Francis?' Loading the shells in the cordite charges wasn't a simple process, and any problems had to be dealt with immediately to minimize the disruption of firing. Where Francis continues, "Suddenly, both rammers gave out, my gun going first. This was caused by number 3 opening the breech before the gun had run out after firing. The carrier arm must have hit the rammer head and slightly metal bound it. I dropped the elevating wheel, got hold of a steel pinch bar, and forced the end behind the rammer head, at that same time putting the rammer lever over to run out. Out went the rammer. I rushed it back again, and then out again, and it was all gay once more. Then the lever was passed over to the right gun, and both rammers were once more in working order. I was pleased to get them going again, as it would have been such a damper on the crew if we had had to go into hand loading. Francis and X-Turret, in company with the other 13.5-inch guns of Queen Mary, opened up on Seydlitz at a range of 17,500 yards, and it wasn't too long after when Queen Mary scored her first hit on Seydlitz. She hit Seydlitz near frame 116 and caused the starboard switch room and starboard turbo dynamo room to fall out. Not 2 minutes later, Queen Mary found her mark once again, striking the barbette of C turret. The shell penetrated the 230mm thick armored plate and ignited munitions in the working chamber. Turret C was immediately enveloped in a large yellow smoke cloud, and the turret was burnt out. Turning to what Corvette and Capitaine Forrester, Seydlitz's gunnery officer, wrote, as found in Gary Staff's Skagerrak, The Battle of Jutland Through German Eyes. Then, approximately 10 minutes after opening fire, Havla reported to me, by telephone, "Turret Caesar does not give any answer. From the speaking tube of Turret Caesar, smoke is penetrating the artillery central." This was exactly the same report I received on January 24th on the Dogger Bank, also at the battle's beginning. I therefore knew what this report signified. The cartridges were in flames, and the turret was put out of action. Almost mechanically, I gave the order, "Flood magazine of Turret C." This put the chamber under water and prevented further damage. As Forster mentioned, Seydlitz was nearly fatally hit in C turret at Dogger Bank. If not for the heroic efforts of 3 sailors, the ship would have most likely been lost, causing changes in the high seas fleet, where Captain Moritz von Egede writes, "Therefore, we made technical improvements and changed our methods of training as well as the regulations. This time only 1 cartridge caught fire. The flash did not reach the magazines, and so we only lost 20 dead or severely burned, and only 1 turret was put out of action." I go into more detail about this in my video on Seydlitz about the changes in the high seas fleet and these hits. We'll discuss the British reaction later on. Getting back to Queen Mary, in the early part of the battle, it's unclear if Queen Mary was hit. However, the flagship line was hit in the Q turret, amongst other hits. These hits, and especially the one to Q turret, will become consequential later. At 4:03 p.m., HMS Indefatigable was struck by multiple shells and exploded in a violent manner, in part due to the unsafe practices we discussed earlier. Queen Mary continued to fire on Seydlitz for a time. Eventually, though, she switched her fire to Deflinge. In turn, Deflinge switched her fire to Queen Mary at 4:17, although for different reasons. We're to take from Steele and Hart again. Behind them, the Queen Mary was still engaged in an evenly balanced contest with the Seydlitz until an unfortunate set of circumstances severely disadvantaged the Queen Mary. When the damaged line weaved to starboard and temporarily dropped out of the British line, von Hassa aboard the Deflinge could not see what was happening. In consequence, when he attempted to engage the second battlecruiser he could see in the British line, he inadvertently switched his fire from the Princess Royal to the Queen Mary at 4:17. Hampered by smoke for a while, von Hassa handed over direct control to his spotting officer in the foretop. Now, his pre-battle fantasies were becoming a reality as the Leviathans exchanged mighty blows, although it was hardly a fair fight at 2-on-1. With both Seydlitz and Deflinge firing hard at the Queen Mary, the barrage of accurate shells soon began to tell. Taking from Francis again, there was a heavy blow struck, I should imagine in the after 4-inch battery, and a lot of dust and pieces flying around the X turret. My attention was called by the turret trainer, A.B. Long, who reported the front glass of his periscope blocked up. This was not very important because we are in director training, but someone in the rear heard him report his glass foul, and without orders, dashed on top and cleared it. He must have been smashed as he did it, for he fell in front of the periscope groaning, and fell off the turret. I wish I knew his name, poor chap, but it's no use guessing. Another blow fell on the battlecruiser, as midshipman Jocelyn Story writes, "Everything went beautifully until 4:21, when Q turret was hit by a heavy shell, and the right gun put out of action. We continued firing with the left gun for 2 or 3 minutes, and then the awful explosion took place, which broke the ship in half by the foremast. Our left gun broke off outside the turret, and the rear fell into the working chamber. The right gun also slid down. The turret was filled with flying metal, and several men were killed. A lot of cordite caught fire below me and blazed up, and several people were gassed." Deflinge and Seydlitz increased their fire, and at 4:25 and 4:26, Queen Mary was struck by salvos again, where staff writes, Der Flinge changed target to Queen Mary and was firing at a range of 132 hectometers, while Queen Mary's opposite number Seydlitz was firing at her at a range of 135 hectometers. At 5:26 hours, 3 projectiles of a 4-shell salvo were seen to strike Queen Mary, but the only result appeared to be a small smoke and dust cloud. And then another salvo of 4 shells, 2 struck the ship, and a tremendous yellow flame erupted, and the ship disappeared in a huge cloud of smoke. Queen Mary was most likely struck in the forward part of the ship, and 1 shell detonated a forward magazine of either A or B turret. On the German side, von Hipper wrote after the battle, and so the Queen Mary and the Der Flinge fought out a regular gunnery duel over the destroyer action that was raging between us. But the poor Queen Mary was having a bad time. In addition to the Der Flinge, she was being engaged by the Seydlitz, and the gunnery officer of the Seydlitz, Korvettenkapitän Forrester, was our crack gunnery expert, tried in all the previous engagements in which the ship had taken part, cool-headed and of quick decision. The Seydlitz only carried 28cm guns. These could not pierce the thickest armor of Queen Mary, but every ship has less heavily armored places that can be pierced with great damage, even by a 28cm shell. About 5:26 p.m. was the historic moment when the Queen Mary, the proudest ship of the English fleet, met her doom. Since 5:26 p.m., every one of our salvos had straddled the enemy. When the salvo fired at 5:26 fell, heavy explosions had already begun in the Queen Mary. First of all, a vivid red flame shot up from her forepart. Then came an explosion forward, which was followed by a much heavier explosion amidships. Black debris from the ship flew into the air, and immediately afterwards, the whole ship blew up with a terrific explosion. A gigantic cloud of smoke rose. The mast collapsed inwards, the smoke cloud hit everything and rose higher and higher. Finally, nothing but a thick black cloud of smoke remained where the ship had been. At its base, the smoke column only covered a small area, but it was widened towards the summit and looked like a monstrous black pine. I estimated the height of the smoke column at from 300 to 400 meters. 2 things before we continue. 1, remember this is a German account, so the timing is different. And 2, authors like Staff are critical of Haas's account due to his downplaying of Seydlitz's role, noting that Moltke's 28cm shells penetrated Tiger's 9-inch belt. In any case, this is what Forrester had to say from Seydlitz. Suddenly, on our opponent, I saw a flash in the aft ship that grew visibly, and this offered to the eye a scene that could move one deeply. But this could not be thought of. In a giant smoke cloud, the ship seemed to lift itself from the water, shattered in the middle, with debris flying all around. The whole picture is framed in a blue-red fire glow. In my battle protocol, I find written, 5:22 hours, our opponent has blown up, direction 88, 130 hectometers. After a moment of hesitation, the report was passed everywhere on the ship, through the telephone and speaking tubes. Our opponent has blown up. Blauf Seydlitz was the reply, and with doubled enthusiasm, they went to work. Target change right on the next ship in the enemy line, I commanded, and the 2-way fight continued on the new opponent. The awful death of Queen Mary was captured by an officer from Tiger's Bridge. I saw 1 salvo straddle her, 3 shells out of 4 hit. The next salvo straddled her, and 2 more shells hit her. As they hit, I saw a dull red glow amidships, and then the ship seemed to open up like a puffball or one of those toadstool things when one squeezes it. Then there was another dull red glow somewhere forward, and the whole ship seemed to collapse inwards. The funnel and mast fell into the middle of the ship, and the hull was blown outwards. The roof of the turrets were blown 100 feet high. Then everything was smoke, and a bit of the stern was the only part of the ship above the water. The Tiger put helm hard to starboard, and we just cleared the remains of the Queen Mary's stern by a few feet. Out of the 1,286 men on board, only a handful survived. All officers except 4 midshipmen died, a total of 20 survivors. Among the dead was the Japanese observer and naval attaché in London, Commander Chisuke Shimamura. The ships around, including both the battlecruisers and escorting destroyers, could only briefly pause as the battle continued, and she slipped beneath the waves. Before the ship slipped beneath the waves, I want to discuss the plight of the survivors, as although the initial damage was tremendous in its magnitude, there were survivors, namely Ernest Francis and X-Turret and several others. Francis writes about the hit and explosion. Then came the big explosion, which shook us a bit, and on looking at the pressure gauge, I saw the pressure had failed. Immediately after that came what I termed the big smash, and I was dangling in the air on a bowline, which saved me from being thrown down onto the floor of the turret. These bowlines were an idea brought into my turret, and each man in the gunhouse was supplied with one. As far as I noticed, the men who had them on were not injured in the big smash. Number 2 and 3 gun crew on the left gun slipped down under the gun, and the gun appeared to me to have fallen through its trunnions and smashed up these two numbers. For a few short moments, there appeared to be a silence, most likely caused by a mixture of temporary deafness and shock. Everything in the ship went quiet as a church. The floor of the turret was bulged up, and the guns were useless. I must mention here that there was not a sign of excitement. One man turned to me and said, "What do you think has happened?" I said, "Steady, everyone. I will speak to Mr. Ewart." I went back to the cabinet and said, "What do you think has happened, sir?" He said, "God only knows." "Well, sir," I said, "it's no use keeping them all down here. Why not send them up around the 4-inch guns and give them a chance to fight it out?" All throughout the ship's company seemed to think that there was something seriously wrong. As Midshipman Peregrine Dearden writes, "There was a terrific explosion forward, and I was sent out into the top of our after turret to see what was happening. I had to put on a lung respirator owing to the clouds of smoke and fire. I could see nothing for about a minute, and then all cleared away as the foremost part of the ship went underwater. I then told the officer of the turret that the ship was sinking rapidly, and so as many as possible were got up out of the turret." A midshipman in ex-turret John Lloyd Owen has this to say after the explosion. "There was a terrific explosion in the forepart of the vessel. I asked the working chamber if they had anything to report. They answered that all the pressure had failed, both guns out of action. I reported this to the officer of the turret, Lieutenant Ewart. He told me that the ship was going down and would probably sink in a few minutes. I asked him for orders, and he told me to send up the gunhouse crew on deck, which I did. After the brief shock, there was a scramble to escape from deep inside the turret. Taking courage, some men led the way, going far beyond the normal call of duty, where Francis writes, "Petty Officer Stairs was the last I saw coming up from the working chamber, and he told me it was no use, as the water was right up to the trunk leading from the shell room. So the bottom of the ship must have been out of her. Then I said, 'Why didn't you come up?' He said there were no orders to leave the turret. I went through the cabinet and out through the top, and Lieutenant Ewart was following me. Suddenly he stopped and went back into the turret. I believe he went back because he thought there was someone left inside. What was left of the Queen Mary was in bad shape by this point. The deck heeled over to port at an angle of more than 45 degrees, where Francis describes the next scene. The ship had an awful list to port by this time, so much so that men getting off the ladder weren't sliding down to port. I got to the bottom rung of the ladder and could not, by my efforts, reach the stanchions lying on the deck from the ship's side, starboard side. I knew if I let go, I should go sliding down to port like some of the others must have done, and probably got smashed up sliding down. Two of my turret's crew, seeing my difficulty, came to my assistance. They were A.B. Long, turret trainer, and A.B. Lane, left gun number 4. Lane held Long at full stretch from the ship's side, and I dropped from the ladder, caught Long's legs, and gained the starboard side. These two men had no thought for their safety. They saw I wanted assistance, and that was good enough for them. They were both worth a Victoria Cross twice over. The plight of the survivors was seen from the other battlecruisers, which, to take from able seaman Victor Hayward on HMS Tiger, one by one, men could be seen coming out of the after turret and climbing down onto the exposed bilge keel and jumping into the water. Also, rolls and rolls of white paper came streaming out of her after hatch, situated on her quarterdeck. These must have been spare rolls of Dreyer's chart paper because her gunnery officer was situated close to the after hatch. It went trailing away over the boiling sea like a shaking toilet roll. When quite a few men were already in the water, the second explosion occurred. As some of the men piled out of the turret and onto the deck, some hesitated when jumping into the water, as although they could swim, the North Sea is an unforgiving sea, prompting Francis to write, "When I got to the ship's side, there seemed to be a fair crowd, and they did not appear to be very anxious to take to the water. I called out to them, 'Come on, you chaps, who's coming for a swim?' Someone answered, 'She will float for a long while yet,' but something I did not pretend to understand what it was seemed to be urging me to get away, so I clambered up over the slimy bilge keel and fell into the water, followed I should think by about 5 more men. After emerging from the turret, Lloyd Owen faced the same scene Francis was looking at. as repeated explosions continued to tear the Queen Mary apart. After all the men had gone out of the turret, I went up myself and found the ship lying on her side. She was broken amidships, her bows were sticking up in the air, and the stern was sticking out of the water at an angle of about 45 degrees from the water. I was standing on the back part of the turret, which was practically level, the turret still being trained to port foremost bearing, the vessel lying on her port side. I looked towards the stern and saw that it was red hot and all the plates had been blown away. Nothing of the framework remained. All around us, men were falling off into the water. A few moments afterwards, a tremendous explosion occurred in the forepart of the vessel, which must have blown the bows to atoms. The stern part gave a tremendous lurch, throwing me off into the water. Just before entering the water, another explosion occurred, apparently just above my head. I sank a considerable distance, and on reaching the surface, could see nothing of the ship, only a great deal of wreckage and oil fuel floating on the surface. Another midshipman story from Q Turret describes the scene of devastation. The men left, and I got to the ladder leading out of the turret and climbed quickly. There was no panic or shouting at all. The men were splendid heroes. Just as I got out of the turret and climbed over the funnels and masts that were lying beside the turret and had gotten off my coat and one shoe, another awful explosion occurred, blowing me into the water. The remaining part of the ship, the after part, blew up, the X-turret magazine going off. The final explosions that tore the ship apart were truly cataclysmic, and were the ones that most likely killed most of the men in the water near the ship as the crushing shockwaves passed through the water, followed by a storm of debris falling from the sky. Where Francis writes, "I struck away from the ship as hard as I could and must have covered 50 yards when there was a big smash. Stopping and looking around, the air seemed to be full of fragments and flying pieces. A large piece seemed to be right above my head, and acting on impulse, I dipped under to avoid being struck and stayed under as long as I could and then came up to the top again. Coming behind me, I heard a rush of water, which looked very much like surf breaking on a beach, and I realized it was the suction or backwash from the ship that had just gone. I hardly had time to fill my lungs with air when it was on me. I felt it was no use struggling against it, so I let myself go for a moment or two. Then I struck out. But I felt it was a losing game and remarked to myself mentally, "What's the use of you struggling? You're done." And eased my efforts to reach the top when a small voice seemed to say, "Dig out." I started afresh and something bumped against me. I grasped it and afterwards I found it was a large hammock. It undoubtedly pulled me to the top, more dead than alive. I rested on it, but I felt I was getting very weak and roused myself sufficiently to look around for something more substantial to support me. Floating right in front of me was what I believed to be the center bulkhead of our pattern 4 target. I managed to push myself on the hammock close to the timber and grasp a piece of rope hanging over the side. My next difficulty was getting on top, and I was beginning to give up hope when the swell lifted me nearly on top, and with a small amount of exertion, I kept on. I managed to reeve my arms through a rope, and I must have become unconscious. Midshipman Storley writes about his experience. "I was sucked down and down in the water, swallowed pints and a lot of oil and gave up hope, but eventually got to the surface and got hold of a floating lifebelt. There was nothing left of the ship except some wreckage and a few heads bobbing in the water. After 5 minutes, the 5th Battle Squadron passed me, firing grandly, and all the German shells were falling short and near us in the water. The swell they made in passing washed me under again, and then I got a hold of a plank. About 10 minutes later, a division of our destroyers passed and appeared not to see us. In reality, they did and signaled for help, unable to stop themselves. This was the worst part, and a lot of people gave up hope and sank. I was again washed clear of the wood by the swell of these destroyers and went down a bit, but eventually got 2 bits of wood under my arms and was kept up. Men clung to whatever they could to keep them afloat, that being debris in the water. Although it was summer, the North Sea was still bitterly cold, as Midshipman Dearden found out. The surface of the water was simply covered with oil fuel, which tasted and smelt horrible. I smothered myself all over with it, which I think saved my life, as the water was frightfully cold. I should say that about 50 hands went over the side, but about half these were killed during the second explosion. Most of the remainder of us held out on 2 or 3 spars and other wreckage on the surface. Shortly afterwards, several of our destroyers came up, but only one stopped. That destroyer was the Laurel, which had been stationed on the starboard disengaged beam of the Queen Mary, where able seaman Albert Hickman was at his action stations as the sight setter on her forward 4-inch gun. We turned to port and under very heavy fire started to pick up survivors. This was made extremely difficult because, in addition to the very heavy shelling, the sea was a mass of wreckage and all sorts of ship's parts, wood, and masses of bits of boats and decking. We had lowered our whaler, but the wreckage was so thick we could not force the boat through it. We abandoned the boat, and somehow we were hauled aboard. Then, nearly all of our guns, crew, and upper deck hands were hanging over the side on fenders, lines, and nets, trying to get survivors aboard. This was made so very difficult because they were all soaked in oil, and we could not hold on to them for very long, especially as we were steaming ahead, as to not present a sitting target to the enemy. We picked up 11 survivors. All except one were in a very bad state. As we steamed away, we noticed about half a dozen survivors on a raft. They cheered us, and I believe they hoped that we would pick them up. The only uninjured Queen Mary survivor we picked up was the left gun layer of the X turret. He was a petty officer, and though shocked, he stood with some of us at the break of the forecastle, drinking a basin of soup. Many of the men in the water were very injured, and that made it difficult to pick them up. Also making it difficult to pick up survivors was the fact that the Laurel could not lose her station as part of the screen covering the battlecruisers for the threat submarines posed. Inevitably, some survivors feared the fate of being abandoned as Laurel steamed off. Some sources say Laurel picked up more men than 11. Nevertheless, some of the remaining survivors were picked up later. Although Queen Mary missed the Battle of Dogger Bank, there were still lessons to be learned from it. In his book, The British Battleship 1906 to 1946, Dr. Norman Friedman discusses the lessons learned from Dogger Bank according to Admiral Beatty. The main point was that Beatty did not believe the German shells were that effective, especially the 11-inch shells, and that his ships were hitting effectively, though they were not hitting fast enough. This idea about a faster rate of fire was prevalent in the Royal Navy before the war and during, especially in the battlecruiser squadrons, with a faster rate of fire being preferred over careful calculation. As we discussed previously, this obsession with speed and gunnery led to unsafe practices. To quote Dr. Friedman, Beatty's ships could not fire as rapidly as he might have expected at Dogger Bank because, over the past few years, standard fleet practices had been to overload the magazines and shell rooms. Cordite magazines was normally stowed in fireproof Clarkson cases. Cordite cartridges were removed from the cases when they went to the hoists. The fuller the magazine, the greater the congestion of the cases at the bottom of the hoist caused. Beatty was not the only one concerned with the rate of fire. After Dogger Bank, his commander, Admiral Jellicoe, circulated a gunnery order pressing for a higher rate of fire and opening fire more quickly, on the ground that, in itself, the British fire on their ships would make it more difficult for German gunners. That is, rapid fire was both offensive and defensive. The problem of the unsafe practices lay in how the officers chose to solve the problem of gunnery speed. They had two ways, where again taking from Dr. Friedman, one was to stow bare charges in the turrets, in the working chambers, in the handling rooms below the turrets, placed there to break up the direct path between the turret and the magazine, and at the bottom of the hoists. In effect, the working chambers and handling rooms became ready-use magazines carrying unprotected charges. A second means of firing more rapidly was apparently to remove the anti-flash doors between the magazines and the spaces at the bottom of the hoist so that cartridges could be passed more quickly. Both practices contravened magazine regulations. I know we could go on and on about the subject, but I have covered it at length in my video on those unsafe practices at Jutland, which I will link to in the description, along with a video that shows her wreck. A short time later, after Queen Mary had gone down, where to take from Flag Captain Alfred Chatfield, I was standing beside Sir David Beatty, and we both turned round in time to see the unpleasant spectacle. The thought of my friends and her flashed through my mind. I thought also how lucky we had been in the Lion. Beatty turned to me and said, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." A remark that needed neither comment nor answer. There was something wrong. HMS Invincible, the world's first battlecruiser. Like the preceding Indefatigable class, Invincible and her sisters were a product of the mind of Admiral Jackie Fisher, and his dictum, "Speed is armor." Invincible entered service in 1909, and when the First World War came, she and the other battlecruisers were stationed in Scapa Flow, waiting for an opportunity to face off against the German High Seas Fleet. This came with the First Battle of Helgoland Bight in August 1914, engaging German cruisers in the Bight with great success. Her speed and firepower proved successful again in 1914 when she and her sister Inflexible dispatched the German East Asia Squadron at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. However, on May 30th, 1916, as the flagship for Admiral Horace Hood's 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, she led the squadron from Scapa Flow, and by the early evening of the following day, she was engaging the German battlecruisers, something quite different than the armored and light cruisers she had faced previously. Invincible was engaged by the leading 2 German battlecruisers, Lutzow and Der Flinge, armed with 12-inch guns, when at approximately 6:33 p.m., she was struck around Q turret, and a short time later, she exploded and broke in two, killing well over 1,000 men, including Admiral Horace Hood, thus ending the career of the world's first battlecruiser. Now, I will leave her design and career before Jutland to another video, as today I want to focus on the loss of Britain's first battlecruiser, as we've done videos covering the losses of Queen Mary and Indefatigable before, and we even briefly covered Invincible's loss in a video on Jutland losses. With that being said, let's get into the video. Late in the evening on May 30th, 1916, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, put to sea, after having received intelligence that suggested that the High Seas Fleet was putting to sea the following morning. At the same time, Admiral Sir David Beatty and his battlecruisers set sail to meet the High Seas Fleet. However, there was something off about the composition of Beatty's force that day, and we're going to play a little game. Let's see if you can spot the difference between these 3 squadrons. Beatty had under his command the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons, and the 5th Battle Squadron of Queen Elizabeth-class ships under the command of Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas. This rather interesting composition would go on to affect the battle in numerous ways. Still, it begs the question, where was the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron under the command of Rear Admiral Horace Hood? Well, they were in Scapa Flow, undergoing gunnery practice. The Battlecruiser Squadron certainly had their issues with gunnery, with Beatty even describing the gunnery of his battlecruisers as, collectively and separately, the battlecruisers' shooting was rotten. One of the explanations was the fact that the Firth of Forth, where the battlecruisers were stationed, did not have a gunnery range near them, and therefore they were unable to carry out sufficient gunnery practice. Admiral Jellicoe decided to rectify this by bringing each battlecruiser squadron up to Scapa Flow, squadron by squadron, to do heavy caliber firing on the ranges developed near Scapa Flow, where Robert K. Massey in Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the winning of the Great War at Sea writes this: to plug the gap in Beatty's ranks while some of his battlecruisers were away, Beatty was to get what he wanted. The Queen Elizabeth would join him at Rosyth. Accordingly, in the 3rd week of May, Rear Admiral Horace Hood's 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, Invincible, Inflexible, and Indomitable, was detached from Beatty for 3 weeks of gunnery practice, while Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas's 5th Battle Squadron, the 5 Queen Elizabeths, came south to bolster Beatty. Not everyone was pleased with this decision. As Massey continues, Hood was displeased by the order. This is a great mistake, he said. If David Beatty gets these ships, the Queen Elizabeths, with him, nothing will stop him from taking on the whole German fleet if he gets the chance. Once the 5 super dreadnoughts arrived, Queen Elizabeth herself went into Rosyth dry dock, leaving Beatty with 4. With the 3 Invincibles gone north and Australia still in dry dock, Beatty's force now consisted of 6 battlecruisers plus 4 fast battleships. This was the force he led at Jutland. So, with that being said, Hood and his 3 battlecruisers, which were the oldest ones operating with the Grand Fleet, those being his flagship Invincible, and the other 2 ships of the class, Indomitable and Inflexible, left with the Grand Fleet on May 30th to eventually join up with Beatty and his 6 battlecruisers and 4 battleships to meet the Germans in a battle in the North Sea. By the following afternoon at 2:30, Hood was operating some 21 miles ahead of the main battle fleet in a scouting role, being escorted by several light cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Jellicoe had also thought that Beatty might need the assistance of his other battlecruisers, as just a little over an hour later, Beatty was engaging the German 1st Scouting Group and all 6 of their battlecruisers. So Hood, at 4:05, was signaled by the CNC Jellicoe to proceed immediately to support battlecruiser force. Hood rapidly ordered his ships to 25 knots to assist Beatty, where we turned to Midshipman John Croom on Indomitable during this time. We could feel the vibration as speed was increased, and the grim calm of suppressed excitement settled on everybody. At this moment, the grizzled old sergeant major came up to me to report everything in the turret correct, and I noted the curious fact that for the first time since I'd been in the turret, he saluted me with perfect precision that he reserved for Marine officers, an honor not previously accorded to me as a sailor of tender years. I thought that perhaps there was at least one old-timer who felt as excited as I did myself. This coming from Jutland 1916, Death in Grey Waters by Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. Hood, Invincible, and the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron raced across the North Sea to get to Beatty, but the weather was turning, it was becoming misty, and soon enough a fog set in, something that would affect the shooting in the battle. Hood had steered his ships on a slightly too easterly course. Hearing firing to the northwest, the battlecruisers of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron steered to investigate. By this point, it was a little past 5:40 p.m., and Beatty had already reversed course after having lost Indefatigable and Queen Mary, and nearly his flagship Lion. Beatty was soon to come into sight of both Hood and Jellicoe, bringing up the rear with the main battle fleet. Hood soon saw one of his escorting cruisers, HMS Chester, who had gone to investigate smoke to the west. Remember, the weather was turning. Chester continued to close the distance to within 6,000 yards of what turned out to be Vice-Admiral Bodeker's 2nd Scouting Group, consisting of the cruisers Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, Pilau, and Elbing. Turning to Massey, because in the haze, Bodeker's light cruisers resembled the ships of the British 1st Light Cruiser Squadron. Chester came closer to take a better look. To encourage the deception, one of the German ships flashed a British identification signal, tempting Chester to come still closer. She was 6,000 yards away and had just recognized the 3 funnel ships as hostile when the 4 German cruisers simultaneously opened fire. A storm of shells swept over Chester, and within 5 minutes she was hit 17 times. Her gun crews and bridge and signal personnel were ravaged. Her rangefinder and its crew were blown overboard. All voice pipe and electrical communications were smashed, and 3 of her 4 6-inch guns were destroyed. But her engines remained intact, and when, a moment later, her assailants suddenly found the tables turned and themselves in terrible danger, Chester was able to slip away to the north. Invincible and the other battlecruisers were not that far away, and Hood could see the orange flashes illuminating the murky sky and turned toward them. Recognizing the shell splashes surrounding the Chester as she came back into view, Hood looked to find her pursuers. Where before the heavy guns began to open fire, this is what John Kroom has to say about the firing of a 12-inch gun in one of the Invincible class. A full charge for a turret gun consists of a projectile weighing the best part of a ton and 4 quarter charges, each weighing about 55 pounds. This explosive little load is brought up from the working chamber immediately below to the breech of the gun by a lift called a cage. This cage consists of a trough in which the projectile lies and a steel box made in 2 compartments, one above the other, in each of which are laid 2 quarter charges. As soon as the cage reaches the mouth of the gun, a folding telescopic rammer shoots out, butts the tail of the projectile, and propels it at great speed into the yawning breach. The rammer then flicks back, and as soon as it is back clear of the tray, the flap door of the cage springs open, and the lower 2 quarter charges drop onto the tray. These are rammed in a little way, and as soon as the rammer is back, the door of the cage is opened again, and the last 2 quarter charges drop out and are rammed into the gun breech. The rammer is withdrawn, the cage drops, the breech is closed and locked, and all is ready. The 12-inch guns of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron soon rang out, and it was the first time that Invincible had fired on enemies since the Falklands. These unexpected heavy shells caused Bodeker to send an urgent message to Vice-Admiral Hipper, in charge of the scouting forces, that he was under fire from enemy battleships, and in the process both Wiesbaden and Pilau were heavily damaged by the accurate gunfire from Invincible and Inflexible. Wiesbaden was sunk by other forces later on, and during this action we come to Kroom again where he writes, "A few minutes later, a signal came through from Admiral Hood commanding our squadron, saying simply, 'Good shooting, Indomitable,' and the message was passed to the guns and cheered us considerably. We now really felt that we were indomitable and our admiral was invincible, and fell to congratulating ourselves." Turning to Massey just before 6 p.m., to rescue the German light cruisers, Hipper sent Regensburg and 31 destroyers to charge the Invincibles. But before most could launch their torpedoes, They were met by a countercharge from Hood's second light cruiser, Canterbury, and 4 British destroyers. In a free-swinging brawl at close quarters, the Germans somehow got the impression that many more British ships were present than was fact. As a result, the Germans only fired 12 torpedoes, after which the 31 destroyers turned back. As this was going on, Jellicoe was in the process of deploying the Grand Fleet and preparing them for action, and made visual contact with Beatty, questioning him where the German battle fleet was. Beatty did not know at that moment, but it soon became evident that they were not too far behind, with Jellicoe writing, "It became apparent by the sound of the heavy firing that the enemy's heavy ships must be nearby, and the Lion, which was sighted at that moment, signaled at 6:06 p.m. that the enemy's battlecruisers bore southeast. Meanwhile, at about 5:50 p.m., I had received a wireless report from Commodore Goodenough, commanding the 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron, to the effect that the enemy's battlecruisers bore southwest from their battle fleet, that his battle fleet bore northeast from his battlecruisers." Meanwhile, Hood had continued west in search of Beatty, where he saw the Grand Fleet approaching on his starboard bow. At that same time, on his port bow, he saw Lion charging east towards him, where we get a description from stoker Sidney Blackman on HMS Inflexible. At that time, I happened to lift the deadlight to have a look out. Invincible was steaming away from us. We were just ready to follow, and she was a glorious sight that I will never forget. A huge bow wave and a white wake, her smoke streaming back and her battle flag flying. The normal station for Hood was just astern of Beatty, but in trying to maneuver to catch him, it would have put him ahead of Beatty. Accordingly, at 6:21 p.m., Hood led his 3 battlecruisers in a 180-degree turn to starboard, taking station ahead of Lion by 4,000 yards. Invincible, Inflexible, and Indomitable were now on a parallel course with the German battlecruisers some 9,000 yards away. The same battlecruisers that had battered the 1st and 2nd battlecruiser squadrons several hours prior. Admiral Hood turned his ship's 12-inch guns onto the German ships with very accurate gunfire, as they had just come from gunnery practice at Scapa Flow. Their 12-inch guns were trained onto the leading 2 German ships, Hipper's flagship Lützow and her sister Der Flinge, where an officer on Tiger writes, "The gunnery of the 3rd battlecruiser squadron was tremendous in its majestic intensity. Great rippling salvos running down the line of the 3 ships. Hits were showing all over Hipper's battlecruisers." Hood's flagship, in a short interval, fired almost 50 shells and hit Lützow 8 times during this period, where Hubert Dannreuther, an officer on Invincible, recalls a message from Admiral Hood. "Your firing is very good. Keep it up as quickly as you can. Every shot is telling." At the same time, Invincible was also receiving hits, but to an outside observer, it didn't seem to cause that much damage. Where we turn to George von Hasse, the first artillery officer on SMS Der Flinge in German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations by Gary Staff. "Her guns were trained on us, and immediately another salvo crashed out, straddling us completely. Range 9,000, roared leading seaman Hanel. 9,000, salvos fire, I ordered, and with feverish anxiety, I waited for our splashes. Over, 2 hits, called out Lieutenant Commander von Stach. I gave the order, 100 down, good, rapid, and 30 seconds after the first salvo, the second left the guns. I observed 2 short splashes and 2 hits. Von Stach called, hits! Every 20 seconds came the roar of another salvo. At 6:31, the Der Flinge fired the last salvo at the ship. At that same time, Hipper's flagship Lützow was firing on Invincible, and Korvettenkapitän Gunther Paschen writes, Lieutenant Commander Bode quickly and clearly takes over, and to the unspeakable delight of the whole ship, 15 seconds later, our turrets except B speak again. I hear through the telephone everything said by Bode at the gunnery centers, and look again at the enemy. Over, 4 down, salvo, a straddle, salvo. As the sound of the fall of shot indicator squeaks, the red flame flashes up nicely and unmistakably from the water columns around the enemy. Signs of a hit like these make a very definite impression if one is seen twice, and sure enough, only a few seconds pass before the red glow breaks out everywhere, and this ship too blows up. It was Invincible. The unconquerable conquered. Der Flinge, as well as ourselves, had fired at her. For myself, I would not claim the credit from my highly esteemed brothers-in-arms, but to be just to Lieutenant Commander Bode, I must say that I have no doubts as to our being responsible. The squeaking sound, the straddling salvos, and the red flames, all were unmistakable. At around 6:33 p.m., Invincible had been hit in and around Q turret, igniting powder in the hoist and traveling down the trunk of the turret, and ignited both Q and P turrets' magazines. The whole central section of the ship, including the boiler rooms, coal bunkers, and the two amidship turret systems, was ripped apart in a gigantic fireball. Coal dust and other debris spurted from the broken hull, and the mast collapsed inwards, and the flame climbed into the sky, appearing like a tower of black smoke. Where Massey writes, "The ship broke in half, and the two severed halves sank until each rested vertically on the bottom. Then, when the smoke had cleared, a curious sight was seen. As the ship was 567 feet long, and the sea was only 180 feet deep. The bow and stern were seen standing separately, 100 feet of the bow and 100 feet of the stern, each with red bottom paint and gray topside paint, rising perpendicular out of the water." Another eyewitness on the cruiser HMS Yarmouth writes, "Suddenly, a dark smudge seemed to pass along the leading ship's side, the Invincible. Then she disappeared into a huge cloud of smoke and flame. The upper bridge awning was blown high above the smoke and looked like a huge parachute with the iron stanchions that supported it dangling below it. As soon as the force of the explosion was over, the whole thing plunged into the sea. It was awful that a ship could go in seconds like that. Not so much the ship, but those living souls with her." 1,025 out of her 1,031 men, including Admiral Horace Hood, were killed. Those 6 men were picked up, allowing us to hear some of their stories. One of those stories belongs to Royal Marine Brian Gasson, who was at his post as the rangefinder for the ill-fated Q turret, who writes, "Suddenly, our starboard midship's turret, manned by the Royal Marines, was struck between the two 12-inch guns and appeared to me to lift off the top of the turret, and another of the same salvo followed. The flashes passed down to both midship magazines, containing 50 tons of cordite. The explosion broke the ship in half. I owe my survival, I think, to the fact that I was in a separate compartment at the back of the turret with my head through a hole cut in the top. Some of the initial flash must have got through to the compartment, as I was burnt on the hands, arms, and head. Luckily, my eyes escaped. I must have instinctively covered them with my hands. The rangefinder and I had only a light armor covering. I think this came off, and as the ship sank, I floated to the surface." Another survivor, Commander Dan Ruther, who we quoted from earlier, writes about his survival. "She went down with a crash, and I was pushed out of her. When I came up to the surface again, I was a bit out of breath, and I saw a target floating by, so I went to it and got on it, and I found 2 other fellows there. The bow and the stern were right up, leaning out of the bottom." Not everyone in the battle had witnessed the explosion, leading to events like this captured by a 19-year-old midshipman on the battleship Bellerophon as the Grand Fleet passed the wreck. During the lull, we came out of the turrets to get some fresh air, and there, floating around us, was a whole mass of bodies and debris. Some of our sailors were cheering because they thought they were Germans, but unfortunately, they were from the Invincible. It was a terrible experience, and my first experience of death. Another ship that had not witnessed the explosion was the destroyer Badger, which Beatty had dispatched to the area to pick up survivors. And as the crew had not witnessed it, they assumed it was a German wreck, and they were picking up prisoners. Where a lieutenant on the destroyer wrote after the fact, "As we neared the wreck, we could see the water all around thick with flotsam and jetsam, mainly composed of floating seamen's kit bags, with a few hammocks scattered amongst them. We also spotted a raft on which there were 4 men, and on the bridge they spotted 2 other survivors in the water. By orders from the captain, I lowered and sent away the whaler, with our gunner in charge armed with a service revolver. The captain brought the ship alongside the raft, and I waited with our doctor and the armed guard ready to receive the German survivors. Judge of my surprise when the raft was almost alongside to see a Commander Royal Navy, a Lieutenant Royal Navy, and 2 seamen ratings on it. In my surprise, I forgot to dismiss the armed guard, who, no doubt, considering that it was that for which they were there, wanted to seize on the unfortunate survivors as we hauled them on board. However, I quickly sent the guard away and apologized to the commander, who only treated it as a joke. The commander was marvelously self-possessed. I can hardly understand how to this day, a man, after going through what he had, could come on board us from the raft as cheerily as if he was joining a new ship in an ordinary course of events. He laughed at the armed guard and assured us that he hadn't a scratch on his whole body, and that he had merely, as he put it, stepped into the water when the foretop came down. That commander they'd picked up was Dan Ruther, and soon after they picked up Gasson, both of whom, plus the 4 others, made miraculous escapes from the wreck of the Invincible. The Battle of Jutland continued around the wreck in the dead, eventually coming to a close early the next morning. Something we've discussed numerous times on the channel. The wreck of the Invincible would eventually settle at the bottom of the North Sea, where the wreck has been located and surveyed. I'll post a link to some more information on that in the description, as well as a link to a video on the losses at Jutland I discussed previously, detailing some of the reasoning for the losses as I strayed away from that here. At the time of release, it will have been 108 years today since Invincible went down, where I'd like to close out with a quote from Lieutenant Thomas Norman on HMS Benbow as his ship passed the wreck. "I had been keeping my eye open for Zeppelins, as I felt sure they must be about, and although I couldn't see one in the air, great was my joy when I thought I saw one wounded, lying in the water some distance on the bow. As we got closer, I found it wasn't a Zepp, but a ship, and felt rather elated at seeing the fruits of our labors. Alas, on getting closer, I found it was the Invincible with her bow and stern above the water, sticking up in the air at an angle of about 45 degrees, her back broken and resting on the bottom. A destroyer was standing by with some survivors on board, a quantity of wreckage of course about, but no one in the water that I could see." Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it will help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.